The Wright family, on the surface, appeared to have everything. Thomas Wayne Wright was a successful businessman in his early 50s, known for his strict discipline and reputation in the community. He was married to Rebecca, a striking woman in her late 30s who ran a popular local art gallery. To neighbors and friends, they seemed like a couple living the dream, with a beautiful home and a stable, enviable life. But below this polished surface, the family had a hidden fracture, a problem they never spoke of outside their own walls. That problem was Eric, Thomas's son from his first marriage. At 21, Eric had earned a reputation around town, though it wasn't one his father would have liked. He'd been in trouble with the law for minor offenses, had dropped out of college, and now worked basic jobs that never lasted long. He didn't get along with Thomas, and he didn't trust Rebecca. Their relationship was tense. He spent most of his time out with friends or locked in his room, avoiding family gatherings as much as possible. To Eric, Rebecca was a pretender, a woman who had appeared in his father's life seemingly out of nowhere, only 2 years after his mother had passed. He'd never seen her as anything but an outsider, someone who had swooped in and taken over a life that wasn't hers. One lazy afternoon, Eric came home early from a friend's house. The house was quiet, and he thought nothing of it as he headed into the kitchen to grab a snack. It was then that he noticed Rebecca's phone lying on the counter. He wouldn't have given it a second thought, except just as he reached for the fridge, the phone buzzed with a new message. Curious, he glanced at the screen. The preview read, "Can't wait to see you tonight." It was signed with a heart emoji and the name Adam. For a moment, Eric just stared at the phone. Adam? He didn't know anyone by that name, but something about the message caught his attention. Before he knew it, he'd picked up the phone and was scrolling through the messages. What he found made his heart race. There were dozens of messages between Rebecca and this Adam, some recent, others from weeks ago. They were filled with flirtations, secret plans, and intimate language. It didn't take long for Eric to piece together what was going on. His stepmother was having an affair. He set the phone down and took a deep breath, his mind racing. He felt a surge of anger mixed with something else, a sense of opportunity. For years he'd been treated like an inconvenience in his own home, barely tolerated by Rebecca and ignored by his father. But now, he had something big. If his father knew about this, it would shatter the perfect image Rebecca had worked so hard to maintain. For the first time, Eric felt like he had a real chance to turn the tables. That evening, Eric waited until Rebecca came home. He sat in the living room, phone in hand, watching the door. When she walked in, she was humming softly to herself, clearly in a good mood. That mood evaporated the moment she saw Eric holding her phone, her face turning pale as he held it up, displaying one of the incriminating messages. She took a step back, glancing from the phone to Eric, her expression one of shock and fear. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eric smiled, a feeling of satisfaction washing over him. He told her he knew everything, that he had seen the messages, and that unless she wanted Thomas to find out, she would have to do exactly as he said. Rebecca tried to deny it, stumbling over her words as she attempted to explain, but Eric wasn't interested in excuses. He made his demand clear, $500 a month in exchange for his silence. Rebecca's eyes widened, and she hesitated, glancing toward the hallway as if Thomas might walk in at any moment. But finally, she agreed. She didn't have a choice, and they both knew it. With a sigh, she reached into her purse and pulled out some cash, handing it over with a shaky hand. Eric took it, feeling a rush of excitement. He had finally turned the tables, and he was in control. Over the next few days, Eric noticed a change in Rebecca. She was quieter, her usual confidence gone, and she avoided him whenever possible. He couldn't help but smile every time she left a room when he entered. He knew he had her exactly where he wanted her, and he planned to keep it that way. For the first time in years, he felt powerful. But he also knew that $500 was just the beginning. He was going to milk this for all it was worth. It didn't take long for Eric to up the stakes. Less than a week after their initial confrontation, he approached Rebecca with a new demand: $1,000 a month. Rebecca looked at him in disbelief, her face a mixture of fear and anger. "I can't keep giving you money," she whispered, glancing around nervously. But Eric was unfazed. He reminded her of what was at stake, how one word to his father could destroy everything she had built. Rebecca hesitated, but eventually gave in, just as he knew she would. Eric was careful not to push too hard, at least at first. He kept his demands within reach, knowing that he could gradually increase them as time went on. He enjoyed watching Rebecca squirm, seeing the way she flinched every time he walked into a room. But he also knew he had to be smart about it. He didn't want to blow his cover too soon. He had the upper hand, and he planned to make it last. As the weeks passed, Eric grew bolder. He began treating the house as if it were his own, hosting parties when his father was out of town, bringing friends over without permission, and borrowing Thomas's car whenever he pleased. Rebecca tried to stop him, but her protests were weak, and Eric easily brushed them off. He knew she wouldn't risk crossing him, not when he held the key to her secret. Meanwhile, Thomas remained blissfully unaware of the chaos brewing under his roof. He went about his business as usual, focused on his work and his community engagements, leaving Rebecca and Eric to their own devices. But even he couldn't ignore the tension that was building. He began to notice the way Rebecca avoided Eric, the way she flinched when he spoke to her, and the way Eric seemed to hold some unspoken power over her. He didn't know what was going on, but he sensed that something wasn't right. For Eric, this was all part of the plan. He wanted to keep his father in the dark, to let him continue believing in the perfect family he thought he had. But he also knew that eventually, the truth would come out, and when it did, he wanted to be the one in control, the one who held all the cards. He had waited years for this opportunity, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. For now, he was content to play his game, knowing that every move he made brought him one step closer to the ultimate payoff. Eric had tasted power, and he wanted more. In the weeks that followed his initial confrontation with Rebecca, he pushed his advantage at every opportunity. He no longer asked for permission to borrow his father's car, and he treated the house like his own private domain. Rebecca could do little to stop him. Whenever she tried to assert herself, Eric would remind her of what was at stake, and she would fall silent, her defiance fading into helplessness. But Eric wasn't content with simply controlling Rebecca. He wanted more than just the thrill of holding something over her. He wanted to make her pay. He demanded more money, upping his monthly blackmail to $1,500. At first, Rebecca tried to push back, telling him she didn't have the funds. But Eric simply reminded her of the consequences, and once again, she gave in. He could see the toll it was taking on her. She looked tired, her usual polish and charm dulled by the stress of maintaining a double life. For Rebecca, every payment felt like a step deeper into a nightmare she couldn't escape. She had once thought she could control the situation, that she could keep Eric quiet with money alone, but it was clear now that he wasn't going to stop. He was like a predator, and she was his prey. She could feel him closing in, tightening his grip with each passing day. Her relationship with Thomas suffered. She was distant, withdrawn, always distracted. Thomas noticed, of course, but she told him she was just busy with work. She threw herself into her gallery, hoping that immersing herself in her passion would somehow make the rest of it go away. But it didn't. Every time she came home, Eric was there, a constant reminder of her mistakes. As the holidays approached, the tension in the house grew even more unbearable. Eric seemed to delight in making Rebecca squirm. He would drop casual hints about Adam whenever Thomas was within earshot, a wicked gleam in his eye, as he watched her pale and struggle to keep her composure. Once during a family dinner, he made a pointed comment about hidden lives that left Rebecca fumbling with her glass, barely able to contain her panic. Thomas noticed, of course, but he dismissed it as a strange quirk of Eric's humor. He had no idea what was really going on, but even Eric knew he had to be careful. He didn't want to push Rebecca too far, too fast. He was walking a fine line, one that required careful calculation and subtlety. He knew that if he overplayed his hand, it could all come crashing down. He was addicted to the power he held, and he wasn't about to give it up. Rebecca, for her part, was running out of options. She considered leaving, packing her bags and disappearing, but she knew she couldn't do that to Thomas. Despite everything, she loved him, and the thought of him finding out about her affair and the blackmail was unbearable. One evening just before Christmas, Rebecca received a text from Adam. He wanted to meet to talk things over. She hesitated, knowing that every meeting carried a risk, but she needed someone to talk to, someone who could help her find a way out of the mess she'd made. She told Eric she was going out for a business meeting and left the house, her heart pounding as she drove to the small, out-of-the-way cafe where she and Adam had agreed to meet. When she arrived, Adam was already there, waiting for her at a corner table. He looked concerned, and she could tell he knew something was wrong. She told him everything about Eric's blackmail, the constant fear she was living under, and the way it was destroying her life. Adam listened, his face growing darker with each word. He was angry, not just at Eric, but at the situation Rebecca had found herself in. He wanted to help, but he wasn't sure how. They talked late into the night, exploring every possible option, but no matter how they looked at it, there didn't seem to be a way out. Eric held all the cards, and Rebecca was trapped. Meanwhile, Eric was back at home, feeling restless. He knew Rebecca was meeting Adam, and though he didn't know the details, he could guess what they were discussing. The thought of them plotting against him made his blood boil, but he reminded himself that he was still in control. He had the evidence, and he had the power. If Rebecca thought she could escape him, she was sorely mistaken. When Rebecca returned home that night, Eric was waiting for her. He could see the strain on her face, the way her shoulders sagged under the weight of everything she was carrying. He didn't ask where she'd been. He didn't need to. Instead, he made a new demand, one that sent a chill down her spine. He wanted her to sell one of her most valuable paintings, a piece she'd spent years curating, and hand over the money. It was a test, a way to see just how far he could push her before she broke. Rebecca tried to refuse, but Eric wouldn't take no for an answer. He reminded her of the messages, the photos, the proof he held that could destroy her. She was backed into a corner, and they both knew it. With no other choice, she agreed, her heart sinking as she realized just how deep a hole she had dug for herself. She felt like a puppet, with Eric pulling the strings, controlling her every move. She knew that as long as he held her secret, he would never let her go. The sale of the painting went through quickly, and within days, Eric had the money in his hands. He spent it carelessly, throwing parties and buying things he didn't need, reveling in his newfound wealth and power. Rebecca watched helplessly as her life crumbled around her, unable to stop the slow-motion disaster unfolding before her eyes. She knew she had to find a way out, but every time she thought she'd found an escape, Eric would tighten his grip, reminding her that she was his to control. It was then that Rebecca began to realize she couldn't keep this up forever. Eric was never going to stop, and if she didn't do something soon, he would ruin her completely. She started thinking of desperate solutions, things she'd never considered before. But no matter how dark her thoughts became, she couldn't bring herself to take action. She was trapped, and it felt like there was no way out. As Christmas drew closer, the atmosphere in the Wainwright house grew colder. Thomas noticed, of course, but he was busy with work, too preoccupied to dig deeper. He didn't see the way Eric's shadow loomed over Rebecca, or the way she seemed to shrink in his presence. All he knew was that something was wrong, and he had no idea how to fix it. For Eric, this was all part of the plan. He was playing a long game, one that required patience and precision. He knew he was walking a fine line, but he was confident in his ability to keep control. He had waited years for this, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. Rebecca was his now, and he was going to make sure she never forgot it. The day after Christmas, the Wainwright house was still, as if everyone was holding their breath. Eric had backed Rebecca into a corner she could hardly imagine escaping from. She felt the weight of his power over her with every step she took. Her gallery was in jeopardy now, drained of its most valuable pieces, all to satisfy his relentless demands. The art world had started to notice the gaps in her collection, and clients were beginning to ask questions she couldn't answer. Eric seemed to grow bolder with each new concession. He was emboldened, but also intoxicated by the control he wielded. He didn't just want her money or her fear. He wanted complete domination. He was already thinking about how to tighten his grip further, how to twist the knife in ways that would hurt her more deeply. But Rebecca wasn't the same woman she had been when this started. She was beginning to change, hardened by the pressure, her survival instincts finally kicking in. She had been pushed to her limits, and now she was thinking of how she might turn the tables on Eric. She knew she couldn't go on like this, and it dawned on her that she would have to fight back or lose everything. Her opportunity came sooner than expected. That evening, Rebecca sat quietly in her gallery office, waiting for the last of her clients to leave. She had done her best to keep up appearances, but inside, she was a mess of emotions, barely holding it together. As she locked up, her phone buzzed. It was Adam, checking in. He'd grown increasingly worried about her since their last conversation and wanted to see if she was okay. Rebecca hesitated, but then agreed to meet him. They arranged to meet at a quiet spot out of town, where they could talk without fear of being overheard. She needed an ally, someone who could help her think straight, and Adam had always been a voice of reason. She drove through the darkness, her mind racing with possibilities. When she arrived, Adam was waiting, looking as concerned as ever. They found a secluded bench, and she poured out her heart, telling him everything. She spoke of Eric's cruelty, his relentless blackmail, and how he was systematically stripping away everything she held dear. Adam listened, his face growing grim as he realized the full extent of what was happening. "I can't go on like this," Rebecca whispered, her voice thick with desperation. "He's going to ruin me, and there's nothing I can do to stop him." Adam's expression hardened. He put his hand on her shoulder and assured her that she wasn't alone. He told her they would find a way to put an end to Eric's game, no matter what it took. But even as he spoke, Rebecca could see the doubt in his eyes. They both knew the risks. Eric wasn't someone they could simply negotiate with or scare off. He held all the cards, and as long as he had the evidence of her affair, he was untouchable. Still, they were determined to try. Back at the house, Eric was beginning to grow impatient. He'd noticed Rebecca's absence and guessed that she was meeting Adam again. It irked him, knowing that she might be plotting behind his back, but he felt secure in his position. He had the power, and he wasn't worried about any plans she might be making. He was already thinking ahead, considering how to ratchet up the pressure even more. The next morning, Rebecca returned home, her mind made up. She wasn't going to let Eric destroy her life any longer. She'd spoken with Adam, and they had devised a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was all they had. They would gather their own evidence, turn the tables on Eric, and expose him for the manipulator he was. They needed to be careful, and they knew they couldn't afford any mistakes. But it was their only hope. For the next few days, Rebecca played the part of the submissive stepmother, giving Eric his money and obeying his every demand. But she was always watching, always listening, waiting for the right moment to strike. She knew it would be dangerous, but she also knew she had no choice. This was her last chance to regain control of her life, and she was willing to do whatever it took to succeed. Eric, oblivious to her plans, continued his relentless campaign of control. He demanded more money, more concessions, and even hinted that he wanted access to her gallery's finances. Rebecca played along, pretending to comply, but every move he made only served to strengthen her resolve. One night, when Eric was out with his friends, Rebecca slipped into his room. She knew he kept a spare phone, one he used to communicate with people outside of their family circle. She found it hidden under his mattress and quickly scrolled through his messages, searching for anything that might help her. She wasn't disappointed. There were texts, photos, and conversations that painted a picture of Eric's life outside the house, one filled with illegal dealings and questionable activities. She snapped photos of everything she found, careful to put the phone back exactly as she'd found it. Her heart raced as she returned to her room, knowing she was one step closer to freedom. She couldn't believe the risks she was taking, but she also felt a newfound sense of hope. She had evidence now, something she could use to fight back. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next day, Rebecca met Adam in secret, showing him the photos she'd taken. They went over their plan, refining the details and deciding on the best course of action. Adam insisted on confronting Eric himself, but Rebecca knew that wasn't an option. Eric was too dangerous, and she didn't want to risk anyone else getting hurt. This was her fight, and she was prepared to see it through to the end. For the first time in months, Rebecca felt a sense of purpose. She was no longer just reacting to Eric's demands. She was taking control. She knew it would be a difficult battle, but she was ready. She was tired of being a victim, tired of letting Eric dictate her life. She had made her choice, and now there was no turning back. Back at home, Eric was beginning to sense that something was different. Rebecca was quieter, more composed, and he could feel the tension in the air. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he knew she was up to something. He decided to keep a closer eye on her, but it was already too late. Rebecca had the evidence she needed, and she was ready to bring him down. As the days passed, Rebecca prepared herself for the final confrontation. She didn't know exactly how it would play out, but she knew one thing for sure. She would no longer be Eric's pawn. She had endured months of fear and manipulation, but now she was the one holding the power, and she was ready to use it. Rebecca knew it was time to act. She had spent weeks gathering evidence, quietly compiling a file on Eric's activities. It wasn't just his threats against her. It was everything he'd been involved in over the past few years. She had photos, text messages, details of his illegal dealings, and enough proof to show Thomas exactly who Eric had become. The tension in the house was almost unbearable. Eric was growing more aggressive, pushing Rebecca harder each day, convinced that he could squeeze more out of her. He had no idea that she was ready to expose him. She waited for the right moment, knowing that once she made her move, there would be no going back. The opportunity came one evening when Thomas was out at a business dinner. Rebecca knew she'd have a few hours alone with Eric, and she was prepared. She called him into the living room, her face calm but resolute. Eric sauntered in, looking smug as always, but he stopped short when he saw the stack of papers on the coffee table. "What's this?" he asked, eyeing the documents with suspicion. Rebecca didn't flinch. "It's everything I have on you," she replied, her voice steady. She watched as Eric's confidence wavered, his eyes scanning the papers. He reached for the stack, flipping through photos of his messages, records of his illegal transactions, and other evidence she'd gathered. "Where did you get all this?" he asked, his tone sharp with anger. "Does it matter?" Rebecca shot back, crossing her arms. "I know everything, Eric. You've been blackmailing me for months, and I'm done with it. You're going to stop, or I'm going straight to your father." Eric's face twisted with rage, but Rebecca held her ground. She could see the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to figure out his next move. She had taken him by surprise, and he wasn't used to feeling cornered. He glared at her, his fists clenched, but she didn't back down. "You think you can scare me?" he sneered, trying to regain his footing. "You're bluffing. You wouldn't dare go to Dad." Rebecca shook her head. "I've already made copies of everything. If anything happens to me, those copies will go straight to Thomas and the police." She let her words hang in the air, watching as Eric's expression shifted from anger to something else, fear. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Eric looked at her, his gaze hard and calculating. But Rebecca could tell he was rattled. She had hit him where it hurt, and he knew she wasn't bluffing. Slowly, his posture relaxed, and he forced a smirk. "Fine," he said, his tone cold. "You win. I'll back off." He turned to leave, but Rebecca wasn't finished. "You're leaving," she said firmly, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "Tonight, I don't care where you go, but you're not staying here anymore." She saw his shoulders tense, but he didn't argue. Without another word, he left the room, slamming the door behind him. Rebecca stayed where she was, her heart racing, but she didn't feel afraid. She had finally taken control, and she knew Eric wouldn't challenge her again. The next morning, Thomas returned home to find Eric gone. Rebecca told him that Eric had decided to leave, that he'd said goodbye and walked out. Thomas looked confused, but he accepted her explanation, too tired to question her further. Rebecca felt a pang of guilt but knew she'd made the right choice. She couldn't risk telling Thomas the whole truth, not yet. It was enough for now that Eric was gone, and she could finally breathe again. In the weeks that followed, Rebecca began to rebuild her life. She worked hard at the gallery, reconnecting with clients and restoring her reputation. Thomas sensed that something had changed, but he didn't press her for details. He seemed relieved to have his life return to a semblance of normality, and for that, Rebecca was grateful. She knew that one day she would have to tell him everything, but for now, she was content to let the past stay buried. Eric disappeared, vanishing from their lives as quickly as he had disrupted them. Rebecca heard rumors from friends, stories of him showing up in other towns, but she didn't pursue them. She was done with him, and she was ready to move on. She had learned the hard way that secrets have a way of coming to light, but she had also discovered her own strength in the process. She wasn't the same woman who had been manipulated and controlled. She had faced her demons and come out the other side, and she was determined never to let anyone hold power over her again. As the months passed, Rebecca found herself feeling lighter, her confidence returning as she put the pieces of her life back together. She knew that the scars of what she'd been through would never fully heal, but she also knew that she was stronger now, more resilient. She had taken back control of her life, and she wasn't going to let go. And so, the way the family moved forward forever changed, but somehow stronger. Rebecca carried the weight of her secrets, but she knew she could live with them. She had found a way to survive, and in the end, that was all that mattered.